Gunig cór an gédal sias smínlam agus chun seochas an crí arm dhéanú trés liú le gach dana tó báilias an siomra se agus iad a bhí Carol Leopard na bliant an 5 blian. May I first of all say how valuable for what I have to say is that presentation that we have just had, and I want to congratulate Dóchas, all of the participating organizations, and all of the individuals, and all of those who have been supporting them in their different ways over half a century. I do want to thank Jane Ann McKenna for the kind invitation to deliver this address. And I want to pay tribute to all those who have been putting this event together. It is correct that it be a celebratory event, an event of recognition and an event of acknowledgement of all of what has been achieved in many different circumstances. I also want to be delighted that you have so many distinguished visitors. For example, Professor Tia Waris, the United Nations Independent Expert on Foreign Debt, and so many visitors. They come to Dóchas because they know that the participating organizations in Dóchas are for real, not only in relation to concern, but they're for real in being concerned at new challenges that are facing. I decided myself that in what I have to say that I would try to concentrate on where I see things now, if that might be a humble contribution to where we might go forward. When you have President of Ireland, as I have been, which is a great privilege, but when it is preceded by having been a member of Cabinet, members of 25 years of Dúlin, those early days of trying to set up a Foreign Affairs Committee and a subcommittee within that Foreign Affairs Committee to deal with development, and of traveling abroad and listening and experiencing, but above all, being in villages. Any of us who've ever done it, when the time comes for you to go away and people are saying goodbye to you, you know that you are tested by your words and actions and policies and what life is really like. I'm finding it difficult, I have to say, to speak in present circumstances because of what is taking place in the world, and I intend to be disciplined about my speech. I mentioned Professor Waris because Professor Waris has undertaken important work on debt restructuring, on tax justice, on how human rights are affected, and systemic reform, and that has been very, very important. But what is understandable, may I begin by saying this then? What is understandable, controllable, accountable, emancipatory? These are questions I have put to myself, and these are the questions that I think might be useful to make a beginning. Yes, Irish people are very supportive of the work of the organizations that form Dóchas. Now, while that is the case, some of the issues that were there so long ago remain with us. I'll give an example of one. Way back in the 1970s, I was one of the people fighting the issue on the suggestion that all these organizations should be responding to poverty, but they're becoming political when they speak about justice. 50 years later, I was still dealing with this issue. So while there is this wide support, there are also some fundamental points of principle in relation to policy that have not been sufficiently clarified, in my view. We fought that issue all those years ago in the 1970s. Somebody I think of, hardly a day goes by without I thinking of Sally O'Neill Sanchez. And the issues we had in relation to debating out of this issue. And the issue, the difference between, for example, yes, being supportive. That's the phrase, understandable. Irish people understand better than most people what are the issues. There's no issue there. And Irish people understand better than most people what, for example, the people in Gaza are going through. And that is good. They understand exactly what is there. They don't need to see again and again on television screens the images of the 30 infants under 2 years of age who have died from dehydration or starvation. The next word I used was controllable. Every day we read about an increase in expenditure on armaments. We increase about decisions are taken in relation the horror that will happen. Will we be able to go to war fast enough if Trump runs out of supporting Ukraine? When the word controllable, I mean in many, many cases, there are issues of understanding the world and then about what can be controlled. Our world in relation to the discourse in relation to all those issues that are over the 50 years is out of control now. The media space for any of those issues is more vulnerable as I'm speaking now than it was as you went through that long path. Not because we were gullible and not because we were naive, it's just that new forces have become more concretized. They've organized better. Look, for example, when you saw all that goodness that was there as people went off to the COP conferences, COP28, and they're outnumbered 120, the kind of people in Dóchas, outnumbered more than 100 to 1 by the representatives of the fossil fuel companies and to the people who have a vested interest in just keeping the destruction of our planet on schedule. I said the third word about controllable, and that's why I very much was very interested in Professor Worth's work, because the issue of international debt, international investment, the allocation of funds in the multinational systems is certainly not controllable, and it's a direct contradiction of democracy. Again, the issue will be there to any of us who care in many cases. Can you affect a great concern in one part of your life and pretend that it doesn't matter, that you're drawing a distinction between, let's say, what you're doing environmentally and what you're doing internationally, commercially? This kind of broken version of the world, that you can have, in fact, your foot in anywhere and that it doesn't matter. It does matter. I mentioned accountable. That I've been very interested in myself in relation to the people responding over decades to issues of hunger and famine, of which I've been involved in. Yes, I was in Somalia with Sally O'Neill and Trochra in the 1991-2, and by Baidoa, when 250 people a day were dying. But the question there was, in relation to being, what do I mean by being all of the different initiatives for Africa that have taken place since, all the different foundations, the new agricultural revolution for Africa. I want to see how they're getting on, but it isn't easy to see how they're getting on. And I'll come to it later in my speech, where there is a straight contradiction between what we do in relation to responding to a great challenge we share, global food security. The issue is, it has been a terrible, terrible disaster that sometime or another we haven't deepened the critique sufficiently to say that while we could change some things at the surface, we were being conned or being asked to travel along a trajectory that was really keeping things the same. And that's true in climate change, that is true in hunger, that is true in relation to the expenditure on war. And I don't say this with any sense of anger. I now say my fourth word, which is about what is emancipatory. We have to get clever. We have to escalate. We have to see how they did it. We have to see inside, for example, every aspect of international finance and debt. And are we not worried, for example, as a philosopher, I would say one thing about it all, about the fundamental concepts of time and space. When last year, for example, people were discussing global poverty, environmental crisis, and migration, and it got 48, it was originally getting 48 hours, and it ended, in fact, actually by getting 3 hours. And the suggestions what was important about the participants was that they were noted as having been there. Some of them wanted to have an influence on the final text that came out. But it didn't matter a thronin, to use an Irish word, that so little attention was being given to each of these components of the agenda itself. And that is going on. I was invited myself to a conference, and I was told I'd have to be less than 2 minutes because another head of state, in fact, had settled for 1 minute and 3/4. I used the fourth term of what I have to say today as to be emancipatory. I'll tell you what is emancipatory. It is when people put in the hard work and understand the economics that's the cause of the problem, that understand the connection between the science and the ecology and what is happening in relation to social outcomes. When they take old imperialist techniques of the 19th century, like anthropology, and they say back, for example, we'll use them now in a different way. We'll use them to empower the villages. You could, in fact, actually get all those 4 words, accountability, transparency, participation, if you had put the tools of anthropology into the hands of villagers. I said that at a university in Manchester just 2 weeks ago, where they had invited me to speak. And I was thinking of her old classical imperialist 19th century anthropology now gone. But what I found as well is that the people who'd adjusted to something, they'd adjusted to something that was a kind of ethnomethodological, whereas in fact people were in fact concentrating what was on micro. There now, and I'll turn and I won't delay on it, how much of the academic world settled into their micro-studies, avoided the macro-studied, were afraid that if they went down the macro road, you might even end up by being called Marxist. And if you were in the United States, you could lose your tenure. And what do you end up with in a plethora of micro-studies? Things that advance individuation. Your career, you get published, you'll make the index and so forth. But all of the other fundamental work is still important in every one of the subjects. I was very pleased to welcome to Áras an Uachtaráin shortly after I became president, I think Hans Sommer, who brought to me the experience of Dóchas. I invited him to join me because of my respect for everyone in Dóchas, all its component organizations, and all of the people who work in it. And also the intelligence that had led them to realize that there were times when in different parts of their projects could be picked apart by not just oppositional forces, but by bureaucracy itself, and that by being able to share their experiences, they were strong, they would be stronger. And I thanked Hans for that, and I thanked Dóchas for it, and as I thank them again today. As I speak now, 2024, we are in a grave position. The rhetoric of war is everywhere. In its consequence, there is a major distraction from all those issues that you have just seen. The discourse on international cooperation that we needed, that you all worked to advance, global hunger, dispossession, land migration. And Dóchas understood from its very beginnings that might happen, the importance and the power of collaboration, of the sharing of ideas and vulnerabilities, and the merging of consciousness. And in doing so, it has enabled international development and humanitarian organizations in Ireland to achieve greater impact by working together under a single voice. And also, I suggest, it enables them each to protect their mandates better. And to shoot in a good news, I was recently speaking to three heads of state from different parts of the world. And if there is going to be a change, and give us a United Nations that is a United Nations, and that cares for all of these issues, I believe that it will come from the South. And I think in relation to conversations that I'm having, what is wonderful is this: when they speak of Ireland, they know of Ireland's practical work. And Ireland has a crucial role in being at the centre of the great change that will take place in the shift of geopolitical power within the next decade. And Ireland's role is in being with that change. It is not, for example, in giving lectures to the South on how, in fact, they are not fast enough in believing the fallacious arguments in favour of war of the North. I feel this very, very strongly. I think now a shared voice must be heard ever more strongly, as with acceptance from too many institutions have just simply said it would be too hard to change. I look back at all those speeches I gave about Weber's nightmare, when Weber said in many cases in one of his periods of depression, it is not spring that beckons, but the icy fingers of winter. And that the bureaucratic form of things that would kind of present itself as something that could not be changed except with great danger would come to destroy all around it. So there are times when you want things to change, and they're not allowed to change because you have made yourself impotent. I spoke in Manchester about how a long time ago one of the great philosophers had spoken about immobilism and what blocks the evolution of consciousness. And what's needed now, of course, is a greater connecting of consciousness. The consciousness against war, the consciousness in favor of ecology, the consciousness in favor of justice, the consciousness in favor of the right to fulfillment and to development. When I was speaking about that philosopher only just a few weeks ago, it struck me how, in fact, people had tried so much of this before. But it's something that is enthusiastic and very, very fulfilling. And later on this week, when I speak about Robert Tressel, I remember there's something that is glorious when people share the commitment. However difficult things are, then give each other courage, and it lifts everyone's spirits when they say, we are going to change it utterly. But I think that shared voice, for example, I do think that some of the institutions, I don't judge them anyway. They just simply have lost capacity. Some are broken, and there are some as well, some just what I call, just bluntly, immorally quiet governments. You get on without too much disaster by keeping your head down. That disgraceful old phrase from the slavery tradition. Keeping your head down and avoiding trouble. What I think is very interesting is this. There must be a shared voice that asks, I think, the fundamental questions. The military-industrial complex defines and destroys our lives. You'll see, for example, those elected. I am elected. I represent twice. But there are people who are not elected at all, who will in fact interchange easily. Military representatives for democratic purpose. You don't know who is speaking for whom just at the moment. Both on the same stage, as if it didn't matter. As if democracy doesn't matter. As if accountability didn't matter. It's very interesting that at the present time, and I think the Stockholm Institute for Study in the Industrial Military Complex has just produced new figures about the increase in profits and in military expenditure. But General Eisenhower, you don't hear Michael D. Higgins quoting General Eisenhower very often, but I think all those years ago he warned about the threat to democratic systems. And as I've just quoted the Stockholm Institute, in their report, Trends in World Military Expenditure 2023, published last month, it highlighted that the world military expenditure increased for the 9th consecutive year in 2023 to a figure of $2,443 billion. This represents an annual increase of 6.8%, the steepest year-on-year increase since 2009, and the highest levels CIPRI has ever recorded. But I mentioned Eisenhower. All those years ago, in April 1953, he said, "Every gun that is made, every warship launched, every rocket fired signifies, in the final sense, a theft from those who hunger and are not fed, those who are cold and who are not clothed. The cost of one modern," this was in that year, 53, "of one modern heavy bomber is this: a modern brick school in more than 30 cities. We pay for a single fighter plane with 500,000 bushels of wheat. We pay for a single destroyer with new homes that could have housed more than 8,000 people. This is not a way of life at all," Eisenhower said, "in any true sense. Under the cloud of threatening war, it is humanity hanging from a cross of iron." The shared commitment to principles of social responsibility and justice is what might sustain us through challenging periods. However, the discourse space is now governed by the politics of fear. Where now stands the rhetorical commitment of so many states to responding to climate change, cohesion and sustainability? The appalling reality is that these great human commitments, singular achievements, struggle for a space in a social media where previous norms of context and responsibility no longer apply. In 2024, we are living in times that cast a dark shadow across the world. We know, are aware, that ours is an era marked by our multiple interacting crises. The spectre of preventable hunger on the increase, the scourge of war, rising inequality, declining cohesion, the perilous consequences of climate change and biodiversity loss. Where, however, is the evidence for institutional change, political change, social rage and confrontation with illegal lobbying, abuse of influence? Bogus myths are again available, ones of defending the West, relying on ancient, false, bogus sources of hate and conflict. The spokespersons for military alliances, as I've said, interchange with elected representatives and their administrators in peddling that myth. As global citizens, dear friends, I suggest each of us has a responsibility to respond to and tackle these crises of accountability and democracy, not merely with new ideas as often suggested, but with alternatives to failed policies and practices, and to do so with sustained effort, energy, and innovation. To ignore these crises is to avert our gaze, as much of mainstream politics is doing. It is a dereliction of a duty of care to our shared planet and its life forms, including our fellow humans and future generations. In this context, the work of Dóchas and its member organizations has never been more pressing, more vital than ever. And I ask your forgiveness for not being able to concentrate on all that you worthily achieved, but I felt I would be more useful by concentrating on the circumstances in which we find ourselves and what we share together as a challenge. Yes, I do salute all that over 5 decades has been done, but I am asking for support for it now in what are necessary confrontations with vastly resourced, overt and more often covert agents of uncountable, destructive capitalism. The sobering truth is that our planet is in crisis. The scientific evidence clear and unequivocal. Planet Earth burning as a result of human economic actions, taken most often by those who wield an unaccountable power in our economies and societies, and with the consequences falling most acutely on the most vulnerable who are least responsible for climate change. The recoil to war, of course, is little less than a great species failure. After all the philosophy and the writing and the role of reason and the different systems of thought in interaction with each other, that those who are suggesting that war is our natural condition, rather than, if you like, Talade de Chardin, that I was quoting earlier, had spoken that love and the achievement of peace is that to which we might most appropriately evolve. The consequences of a flawed interconnection between ecology, economy, and society are evident to everyone. Disturbing climate shifts are exerting immense pressure on communities worldwide, where ecosystems no longer capable of sustaining populations are resulting in a depletion of resources necessary for human well-being and progress, and of course the great immense loss of biodiversity. Most recent reports this week tell us of the despair of scientists and experts as we crash through a warming limit of 1.5 degrees towards 2.5. Our most senior scientists work and weep at the betrayal of what were global commitments in the name of the future of humanity. And that's why I'm pleased that your conference theme this year is climate change adaptation and anticipatory action. Adapting to our changing climate will be vital to ensure food security. We know that as one of its consequences, climate change is already disrupting food availability, reducing access to food, and impacting food quality. Rising temperatures, shifting rainfall patterns, and increasing frequency of extreme weather events pose significant threats to agricultural productivity, livelihoods, and ultimately food security. Speaking to representatives of Kenya, where this is already happening. And that is why I say the response and reform of the United Nations will come from the South, because they are the people who are suffering most from their neglect of the issues at the present time. Millions of smallholder farmers who depend on rain-fed agriculture for their sustenance. Each unpredicted drought or flood spells disaster, pushing them further into poverty and hunger. The impacts of climate change, they're not confined to the agricultural sector. Such impacts reverberate, as I've said, across entire ecosystems, disrupting food chains, diminishing biodiversity that I mentioned, exacerbating existing socioeconomic inequalities. Vulnerable populations, including women, children, and indigenous communities, are bearing a disproportionate burden of these impacts and carrying greater risks, and the responses to them facing heightened risks of malnutrition, displacement, food insecurity. The legacy being laid by failure to act for conflict, violence, and involuntary migration and displacement includes a migration which leads to contested space, and this is widening. Vulnerable groups face the hardest and most immediate consequences as their very survival hangs in the place. And on that, I must say, I am 83. When I was an academic practicing, it was the area I studied most, was migration. And I have never witnessed greater ignorance than on the issue of migration, globally and in Europe and in the international discourse. It is easy to understand and predict the impact of some of what I have been describing and how it affects migratory flows. It is also possible to understand, for example, what are the effects, what do migrants think of in the first move, between that and the second, and so forth. There isn't a serious attempt to understand migration in relation to us, Ireland, are a migrant people. But globally, the idea that you can understand migration separate from understanding trade, economics, biodiversity, the despoilation of the environment, the destruction of the capacity to feed yourself, it has to be discussed together. The heart of the diverse bodies that is Dóchas lies a profound understanding of all those intricate connections between climate change and food security, and particularly in the diverse and vibrant continent of Africa, of which I have been speaking. And with regard to food security and the end point of what I have to say, the challenge we face it, above all, is a challenge to humanity itself in terms of capacity to change, to make a choice between forms of the technical and scientific that can serve international conglomerates with clear monopolizing features. I should give an example. 10 years ago, 7 companies controlled all the seeds planted in Africa. Last year, it was 2 companies because they have amalgamated. I look at the people, for example, who first of all imposed fertilizers and then monopolized its supply. And then the people, for example, who are suggesting that in relation to the Democratic Republic of the Congo, I was in Dhaka, when I see the pacts that have been agreed, it would have a deforestation effect about the size of Kenya. The challenge we face, and it's very interesting about the good work that was carried out all those years ago by others, Marcuse and others, who warned, if you like, about how we handle science and technology and its impact. Not warned, because it is important and it helps us, as we realize, in pandemics and everywhere, but to understand it, and as I said, and be controlled. I think that the choice, as I said, yes, is there a global food, if you're responding to food security, are you referring to this globally? Are you talking about how we can change the existing conglomerates internationally so that they can adjust themselves to be able to provide more? Oh, it's a reasonable point of view. But what about, for example, when you're talking about, therefore, about monoculture? What about who will have agency? There's the question. Who will have agency? Choice of seed, choice of crop, choice of providing, for example, food for the person that is needed, that is necessary, nutrition. Much of what is being proposed in the compacts agreed in Dhaka that I attended after it are in fact about feeding animals. And in addition to that, there are many cases about it. In some places where young anthropologists that I know are studying, women being attracted into the new agro-industry to earn wages, immediately encountering opposition from some men, and then in turn, in many cases, neglecting the household crop, and thus spending the few meager pounds that they have on, in fact, purchasing what is imported. I have argued an entirely different approach in relation to food security. I've argued it in Africa and in Europe, and I will argue it again at the United Nations at the end of this year. And it is one that is about agency in relation to meeting the needs of food, and agency in relation to control of the surplus. And yes, using all of the advances in science and technology in relation to the elimination of and post-production, transport, all of these issues can be done. But the crucial issue is as to whether, in fact, people will be wage labor slaves in agro-industry on the continent, or whether they will, in fact, actually be people who will own land. Because what is underway at the present time is a massive land grab for Africa. I think that in relation to all of this, half of the world's over 80 billion population are defined as malnourished. 2 billion people are experiencing undernutrition. 2.5 billion people consume low-quality diets or too much food. 3 billion people cannot afford a healthy diet. It is an important issue, and it is important that we address it in an entirely new way that reflects the new politics of balance, ecology, and justice and safety. And we have to say where we stand on these competing models of food security. Are we in favor, I put it bluntly, of the science-driven industrial agricultural model without conditions? Or are we willing to insist on small farmer agency, diversity of crops, privileging the priority for meeting local need with essential nutrition, human food systems? We have to face up to the stark facts, and I think that is important. I think in Africa that I've been speaking of, 26.2% of Africa's population experienced severe food insecurity in 2021, with 9.8% of the total global population suffering from undernourishment in the same year. Our agri-food systems are broken, not fit for purpose. The existing systems are causing our planet harm, leading to food dependency, food insecurity, and hunger. Of all those connected to the land in some way on the planet, 71% are in some way or another. 1% of them own land. There is the De Soto model, scandalous as it was in its day in Central America, on the abuse of titles. Let's have titles, and the titles will be able to be collateral for loans from the bank. And then the Grace Corporation bundled the titles together and ended up owning a third of the country. And the De Soto model, Dr. De Soto's model, is alive in Africa today. It's in Africa today in 8 countries that I know in relation to suggesting let's give the people titles, and the titles can be collateral, and then they can be bundled up, and before you know where you are, Africans will not own Africa. We have not addressed, I'm afraid, the basic structural issues that influence food security, and we must address these. I think it is, for now, and you can pose, because I'm coming towards the end of what I have to say, it is a good question to ask. How did it come to be in Africa that it became so dependent on so few staples, wheat, maize, and rice? Did it happen by accident? Those who study the soils and those who study the history of movements in Africa since people began moving from Africa, as we all did, there are about 3,000 sources of food. I think it's very interesting to find how now Africa imports 100 million tons of food at a cost of $75 billion annually. I wonder, you see, how do the complex dependencies of global value chains develop, and in whose interests are they being sustained? And was it a great achievement of an American president to add wheat into the speculative market in the United States? How much of a legacy of colonization and dispossession was in fact as a source of all of this? And then I think as well, today, for what we're responsible for. Our very multilateral institutions are, I would describe it as, under siege from the lobbyists for such interests. I think it is time for us all to take stock of how our words have not been leading to actions, and why, if we are to increase the urgency of our response to what is a grave existential threat and to achieve change. I tried to address this at the Dakar Summit in Senegal and again in Rome. In responding to our destruction, to our very prospects for survival, and for all of our peoples, we must turn a corner. We must move past reactive emergency responses to tackling what are the consequences of the underlying structural causes of hunger that we are not addressing. There is an importance, if we are to ensure access to nutritious and sustainable food for all, the importance of delivering successful food systems, importance of recognizing the link between that, food insecurity, global poverty, migration, debt, climate change. We must work to not just retreat from the dysfunctional food systems model with urgency and embrace models of sufficiency and effective local markets. But what we must do, we must understand it. How did it come to be and why is it happening? And we'll get to somewhere else. There is, for example, it seems to me a most basic moral question. Should you produce to meet the sufficiencies of the village before you concentrate entirely on producing the surplus crop? And what's the distinction between emphasizing the surplus crop in relation to gender and participation and practice? We must ensure that our food production models promote greater autonomies, are informed by local wisdoms, respect seat sovereignty of native practices of indigenous peoples, take cognizance of the consequences of large-scale land and water resource ownerships, and something that is important, soil fertility maps. We must amplify the voices of those most affected by the impacts of climate change and stand with them, ensuring that their perspectives, knowledge, aspirations are central to our collective efforts. We must regionally led initiatives managed and implemented by the people of the indigenous regions, supported by predictable and sustainable funding, are key. So it is easy to show how we need best ecological practices in agriculture, including agroecology, to become widespread models that can promote food security and development opportunities for the poorest people on our fragile planet. It is not my position that that is sufficient, but it is part of what is the alternative. This is so different from mere adjustments to the productionist agronomy model that is there at the present time, or any colonially imposed food system. All of this requires, I finish by saying, a politics of the many, a break with radical individualism. And I wish I could be confident that it will be happen, but it's more important that it does happen long beyond me. If the signs are rather negative, we must escalate our actions and our analysis simply all the more. We must restore degraded ecosystems, introduce drought-resistant crops, all of that, but always with the agency of farmers, and women must own land. We must create new sustainable green jobs for people. All of this is important. We must be, as I said, more radical. Ours must be, yes, a values-led approach to politics and food security. Yes, it must be empirically sound. The problem about all of this is, we haven't said it often enough, is all of what has destroyed our planet was bad economics, and the alternative is good economics. There's a matter of self-respect in the academy in it, no more than I described all those people with their minor concentrations and so forth, that replaced the classical areas that were there in relation to scholarship. So it's in a time for new scholarship, and there should be no university where the different alternative models are not being taught. For example, training people to be a kind of number jockeys so that they are available to work in the financialized economy is extraordinarily valuable and very personal and rewarding. But it isn't good economics teaching, and it isn't good academic practice. I've said it before, and I've listened to the response, and then I replied when I gave the Geary lecture at the SRI. I just want to say this. The Secretary General of the United Nations, with explicit language, has told us that the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals is moving away from us. We are failing. And he also has said the rhetoric of war is what has quenched the discussion. We've had too many broken promises, he tells us. 15% of some 140 specific targets to achieve the 17 United Nations Sustainable Development Goals are on track to be achieved. I repeat it. 15% of 140 specific targets of the 17 United Nations Sustainable Goals. Targets are going the wrong direction, Mr. President. Not a single one is expected to be achieved in the next 7 years. So it is a matter again then about it, and this is what is good, and I say this, I've always met the community that is Dóchas. It is good when we're together, and it is better when we're able to take our arguments and explain them to others. Yes, I think we must redouble our efforts with the greatest urge. We must channel our collective will and determination to sustainable solutions. But it's time for a paradigm shift, a change in consciousness that prioritizes the well-being of our planet over short-term goals. We must be able to face and be able to stand in front of cameras and say, how many people from the NGOs were at COP28? How many from the fossil fuel firms? Who are they? When did you last talk to them? How often do you meet them? Have they access to the Commission? Is the Commission representing the Europe of the peace? Is Europe to represent, for example, the people of Europe? Or is it to represent those who are exploiting, in many cases, not just Europe, but the planet? Yes, when I look around the room, I see all of you who have been so engaged and committed, people who have the enthusiasm, energy, and creativity needed to tackle with vigor, and have the courage to say what we speak of is good economics, sound ecology, fair practices. It's democratic. What you say is not democratic. And face it, take on the people who are representing what is the cause of all of this failure of which the Secretary General speaks. And each one of us, regardless of our individual roles, age or circumstance, communities or professions must take ownership of the commitment to tackle the challenges facing our shared precious planet. At the end of this week, when I speak at the Trestle meeting, and I think of how people celebrate this very often in song. Every now and again they say to us, I remember when I was writing my poem of Saturdays Made Holy, when people would go marching out together, and at the end of the day you've said, we've done something splendid, and we'll do it again next week and the week after. But what is necessary now is to take these careful failed places of institutional advocacy for what is failing and confront it and say to them about it, we want good economics. We want an economics that's able to deal with justice issues, and we want ecological issues. And we want all the young people who go in to be able to hear all of the alternatives, intellectually and morally, that are available in the subjects. As citizens, I conclude by saying, we possess a moral duty to contribute to a profound societal transformation, one that invokes our shared humanity, that establishes a harmonious relationship between ecology, ethics, economy, culture, and a life-lived experience of fulfillment and resonance with each other and the world and all forms of life. Agus mar uachtar na hÉireann. I take this opportunity to once again commend the work of Dóchas for 50 years, its member organizations, and all of those in advocating for policy changes, mobilising resources, empowering communities, taking control of their own, encouraging those people in the villages and on the ground. So many exceptional organisations that have been at the forefront of such good efforts to address the root causes of poverty and injustice in so many areas across the world, enabling people to live their lives with dignity. And certainly not a collection of fringe movements, rather representatives of the alternative, justice-driven movement. And that's how you must present yourself. And let me never again, from the remaining days of my life, have to argue again and say that one should not be dealing with the justice issues because somehow or other poverty is safer. We have no right to be voyeurs on the poverty, the grief, the death, or whatever of the world. That is not our right. It is our best inclination to try and put an end to it. May I express my sincere gratitude to all of you whose tireless dedication, unwavering commitment, boundless optimism, and I hope it survives what I have said. I hope you have contributed to the success of Dóchas. Mo bhuichas le, vis tres liamliam, is gyn gagragas banach dare, das ne blianta, et all the chiocht, is ne herre, et ho chastal. I so wish you every success for the future and in achieving the changes that are necessary, so much beyond yourselves, for all humanity.
I think on behalf of everybody here, I'd like to thank you sincerely, President Higgins, for your words. I think they've really touched a chord with all of us. And as you know, many of our organizations and the people in this room are and do work for justice. And I think what you have mentioned in your speech is really a call to action for our sector. You have said the importance of the shared voice, the importance of us having the courage of our convictions to stand against the injustices that are happening more so now than ever. And I think that is an inspiring and motivating and encouraging words really for all of our delegates here today to leave with, because I think your words have really been key. And I think one of the things that you said about who will have agency, I think it's important for all our organizations within the Dóchas membership to look at how we are doing that within our own organizations. How are we ensuring that the local communities we work with, how we are ensuring not only that we are amplifying their voice, but we are giving them the agency that they are entitled to, and that we are giving them the platform that they need. So I'd like to thank you very much for that. So, ladies and gentlemen, it's come to the time, unfortunately, that if we can please bid farewell to President Higgins and his wife, Sabina Higgins.